Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's episode, I'm going to be touching on a few things. I got new glasses. I don't hate them, but I actually don't love them. But neither here nor there. I want to talk about religion and money because I just think that this piece right here, we're just going to get right into it. One thing I found with religion and money is that religious communities really hinder individual and even collective upward mobility. It hinders a person's future goals, right? When you have the mindset that the world is evil, and that there are just a lot of people in the world who are just evil, everything is meaningless. When you just really don't, when you believe in a lot of conspiracies, right? Conspiracies are things that aren't necessarily proven. It's going to be really hard for you to move forward and to actually do anything with your life. And I kind of want to just talk about how for a lot of people, people finding meaning in the church, right? I cannot stress this enough. I think that the people who are the most enlightened and I would say personally satisfied, are probably educated people. And I don't mean educated in the sense of a collegiate degree per se, but I'm talking about personal education, right? I think one of the things that's really unfortunate about religious communities and people who foster these communities and these audiences based on some type of denomination, whether it's Islam or whatever the case may be. And it doesn't necessarily everything that goes within the practice doesn't necessarily fit with the individual. What's really unfortunate is that for so many people, because of their lack of education in their personal lives, right? Lack of education, concerning themselves, who they are, what they really like, what they really want, and just not really having any real insight, outside of what is always being taught to them, right? I talk about this a lot. When it comes to college, it's there's this huge danger, right? When it comes to American institutionalized learning, is because what you have, for 12 plus consecutive years is someone literally sitting here talking at you. I remember being in my college classes and engaging with my professor. And it was something that most people just didn't do. I mean, you think about it, you're a freshman, you go in, you come in from high school, there's a teacher, there's a PowerPoint, and that's pretty much the lecture. And, Bell Hooks talked about this a little bit in her book, Teaching to Transgress, just how that we really need to have reform in our classrooms and how we do study. But overall, not a lot of interaction there. So what that really does is set you up to be someone who is always being taught, right? Someone is always speaking to you. You're never really given the opportunity to formulate your own thoughts, opinions, beliefs, and sometimes even values in this case. And so what happens is you find yourself in cycles of abuse, taking on other people's interpretations of a thing, even if it's not even your personal interpretation, right? Our interpretations shift, and they're all generally different depending on our experience, right? We find content creators that we can relate to who may have shared a similar life experience, but there are people who are giving, pastoral positions or leadership positions, and we actually cannot relate to anything that they've gone through, right? And so what you have is a person who's got this unique perspective, and they're coming out and they're teaching you, and it's not anything that you can actually relate to. So it's you find yourself in this place where you're really being duped in a lot of ways, because it's somebody is teaching you something wrong that doesn't actually align with your values, and you just kind of go along with it. So that's kind of I'd say that the Western institutionalized learning is the premise of that, but it's something that just kind of follows in every other aspect. And so you kind of just submit necessarily to technically to any leader or authoritative figure, instead of questioning certain things or really engaging with them from a more of a, free kind of way. So I want to kind of talk about the fear and the guilt that develops and drives a lot of religious leaders and a lot of people within the religious communities. I've noticed that in order to get something from people, a lot of people who are unhealthy and who want to get something from people will use tactics such as fear, shame, and guilt. And it's not just something that happens in the church. This is just something that very malicious people do. They will guilt you, right? So they'll tell you, you are with men and you're doing all this, but you're not giving to the church, right? Or they'll tell you that you're in your situation because of who you are, right? Even if your situation is not necessarily a byproduct of your choices per se, but if your situation is just happenstance, right? I'm reading this book right now. It's called Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? It's by a Jewish rabbi, first name Larry, can't remember the last name, probably can't pronounce it, but the book is very interesting. Nonetheless, I can't say that there's a lot of insight there, so I could do a book review or I can't, whatever you guys want. But I would say that generally, the book just kind of talks about how, the reality is that sometimes there is no meaning for the things that happen in life. And sometimes there is no justification to the suffering that we go through. And I think that there's a content creator on TikTok that I really like. His name is Donnell Wrights. He really goes into this, this philosophy as it pertains to religion and suffering, right? And how, we're rewarded for our suffering. That's the whole premise. He does a lot of great research in that. Go check him out. But, yes, I've heard people, guilt people who drink, and I'm not talking about, alcohol, right? I'm not talking about, alcoholics or people who may be addicted to alcohol. Obviously, that's not something that's very healthy, but I'm talking about people who are grown adults who may enjoy social hour, whatever the case may be. There's just always a lot of guilt and control when it comes to a lot of religious leaders because they want you to, it's kind of how they factor community and how they get you to stay in their community and stay giving to them. I made a short where I just kind of talked about how it's really crazy to me how a lot of people are in the church faithfully day in and day out, and they don't have a job and they actually can't provide for themselves and they don't have any money. That was something that was very alarming to me, but it seems as though for a lot of people, this is the expectation. Now, or this is just the way of life. I'm not really sure. I don't really want to, I'm going to have to address a little bit of nuance here. I'm not talking about people who've had certain life experiences. I'm not talking about those who are incarcerated, who maybe can't find work. I'm not talking about those one-offs. I'm talking about those people who have been impacted by whose upward mobility and whose future has been impacted by religious theology. Okay. That's what I'm talking about. So, and then you talk about like the aspect of anti-Blackness, which I don't really feel like I've found a content creator who's really broke this down in a way that is like so clear and concise and really hits on a lot of different things. Quite frankly, I think that there's so many elements to this conversation that it probably needs to be an essay or a thesis or something because it is very, very profound. But I'll say that this is kind of where I stand with this, right? I think one of the things that's most unfortunate about the church is that it really negates African-American literature. It negates history and intellectualism in every form, fashion, and design. But it also kind of has this thing where it's like, and I'll kind of address this too, because I kind of didn't like write down like everything I was going to say concerning this point. But I do think that it really has a way of kind of like shifting some people from their Blackness. But one of the things that I'll say, and this is probably where I stand concerning a lot of things, is one thing I realized is that within the Black community, there's a lot of violence, and it's not just physical violence. I'm talking about mental, emotional, and spiritual violence that is committed against one another. This conversation in particular, I'm not necessarily pertaining to any other culture that commits violence. We know that violence is just something that is all across the spectrum, but I kind of wanted to talk about this just a little bit and just kind of like address it and how violence is our expectation, right? We're rewarded for the violence that we commit against one another. You can kind of see this in modern day relational discourse, how, many of the males, and I don't know any female content creators who use acts of violence and who speak, talk about like mental violence and aggression and all those things, but I'm sure they're out there as well. I haven't found any, but I'm sure they're out there. But just how they're able to garner audience and even capital. And essentially there's a reward, right? I wrote a column today. I gave a brief example of this, just how growing up in public schooling, you'll just kind of find that for a lot of Black kids, right? The expectation is that if someone is disrespecting you, the expectation is for you to respond with violence. And then, if you were to turn a blind eye and respond with kindness, then more violence is actually going to be given to you. So that's just a conversation for another day, but just kind of wanted to touch into that. I think that actually kind of shifts gears and takes us off of this episode into something that's completely different, but just an observance. And it's definitely something that is rewarded. I mean, you can kind of see this with some content creators, such as like the Shade Room and the things that they share, just even their large audience in itself, right? How they really have the eyes and the ears of vast majority of Black Americans, like, you know what I mean? So it just goes to show that, you know, we're rewarded for humiliating one another. And I think when you kind of grow up in that context and you're so tired of just always being in spaces where you're degraded and humiliated and talked about, you know, and I'm not to say you're not going to find it, right? When I say these things, I'm addressing these things as they are. I'm not addressing these things in comparison to any other culture, right? This is just what it is. So I just think that when you grow up in like lack and scarcity, and there's a lot of people who are literally deprived of education, who don't know how to articulate themselves, who don't know how to emotionally regulate, who don't, you know what I mean? So it's like you grow up in that environment and there's just so much chaos and so much dysfunction. You kind of just get to the point where you're just like, listen, you know what I mean? I'm not saying that, hey, you know what I mean? X, Y, and Z is a solution. I'm just bringing something to our attention here on this YouTube video and stating the facts, okay? But another video for another day. And I want to kind of talk about religion and money and conclude with this. Here's what I've learned. I've learned that people who have actually don't get a kick out of people begging them for money. It's actually very unappealing, especially as an adult, to carry yourself in a way that you feel so entitled to somebody else's wealth. It really doesn't matter how much money they have. I just think that, you know, we live in a society today because I think that adolescence is reigning. I think that the youth is, you're right, Gen Z, all over social media, influencer culture, like they're just really, really prevalent today. And they're the spokespersons, right? And I don't know if the youth has always been the voice of the future, but that's kind of what's happening today. And so you kind of have this like childlike entitlement that is kind of like infiltrating every aspect and every person's mentality. And I think that this is something that really goes on in the church. And I started to question, why is it that, you know, there are some people who, and actually it wasn't me posing this question. Let me say that. There was a content creator who actually posed this question, and she just kind of posed the question, why are so many Black people religious if they are one of the most oppressed groups? Now, you already know we can go over the slave Bible. We can talk about what happened with, you know, slavery and our colonization and our captivity. And we could talk about Desmond Tutu, and we could talk about all those different things. But one thing that really did, you know, make me question was what it is about religious communities that start to foster a sense of entitlement for other people. And I started to formulate some type of some answers, right? And what I've, you know, come up with so far, what I've hypothesized, right, is this could possibly be due to the lack of education, right? So when you don't know how to show up in the world and you are undereducated, you don't know how to conduct yourself, you don't know how to go about professional and personal development, you may find yourself in communities where it's almost like a cultic, and yes, there may be a lot of praise and worship, but there may not be any real life skills that are cultivated within you. So what you're going to find is you're actually going to be someone who, though you may have spent your whole life in the, you're actually going to be very much underdeveloped as a person. And so what you'll have is people who just kind of start to foster ideals, right? Religious theology kind of fosters this ideal of expectancy and entitlement towards others. And I don't know whether or not this impacts certain groups more or less, but this is something that I've just kind of noticed. It seems like where there's a lack of education, where there's a lack of ability to show up in the world and actually be productive and actually have success, you know, a lot of times there's debunking of that. And I think in part it's because of the lack of life skills, right? And you can blame America, or you can just, just take into consideration all that, you may not know, and all that is typically shunned in religious communities, right? Education is not something that is typically encouraged in religious communities. And so, yeah, just a thought. But because I'm running out of storage on this iPhone and there has been so much chaos trying to get this video uploaded, I think I'm going to end here. I hope that this was insightful. Peace.